but he's fine. Hello, everybody. So today I wanted to make a little bit of a video about the historiographical essay. You have the overview video, but you don't have really many specifics. Ultimately, the biggest asset to you is going to be the sample essay and the outline template. Okay, we have the outline coming up next, and basically in that outline, we're just identifying the major pieces of information that we'll utilize in the essay. That outline will be peer reviewed, by two peers, and then we will have, to convert that into our essay for this second project. Now, when it comes to historiography, the biggest thing that I mentioned in my other video is that this is ultimately a report of information that other scholars have said about your work, right? Your primary source. So basically, you're identifying the things that these other scholars are talking about. Your argument doesn't enter into it. Okay, that being said, that little reminder there, the things that you want to make sure that you do in your introduction, you want to give a little bit of a brief, informative, contextual bit of information that identifies, where this, what your frame of reference is for the sources that you're using. Okay, if you were to look at the sample, you'd see I discuss a little bit about Grendel's mother. If you use any specifics from your primary source, you will want to cite that from the primary source itself. The primary source can be used in this historiographical essay, and in fact, I do recommend that you put at least a nod in there, to say this is where, this particular source is discussing XYZ data, just so that you can have that frame of reference. But essentially, what you want to do in the intro is you want to, talk about this particular framework for your own argument, right? While not bringing your argument into it. Meaning, what is it that stood out to you in these pieces that you found interesting that end up being the discussion of these similarities or differences or interactions, if you will, between these sources and their ideas? So, you want to give the reader enough information there. Now, remember, this will be a tool for you to see how these sources are discussing similar ideas, right? And then you'll use this, to have a repository of information, just like your annotated bibliography, for your research paper at the end of term. So what you want to do is give enough context for the reader to understand in the intro. In the thesis statement, you want to indicate scholars, right? Say that this essay is about scholarly data, the things your scholars are saying about your source, or the things that if you're using, sort of contextual sources, what these sources are doing and contributing to this sort of argument that you've got in the back of your mind. Remember, it's not at the forefront here. But it's these ideas where these sources overlap. If you're talking about, let's see, one of you is talking about religion in Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, as your, argument for your essay. Now, if you're, in this, what you'd want to do is say, scholars are discussing these three facets related to religion, right, however they're related, right, be specific. In Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, if it's a contextual source, it might be providing information about religion during the time period. If you see overlap between your sources about discussing religion during that time period, awesome. Use that as one of those three pieces of information that you're focusing on here, right? So take that idea of intersecting ideas, that you did in the last assignment and put that toward your thesis statement. What are those three main ways that your sources are interacting with, each other? And those should be identified, right? You've got to say scholars to let your reader know that this isn't about your argument. It essentially sets the tone that this is historiography rather than your or your own argument. So we're identifying scholars, and then we're identifying at least three ways that our sources are interacting. Okay, and we don't need to say scholars' names in this in this thesis statement, right? And the reason for that is because you'd have a list of 6 secondary source scholars in your thesis, and that's a lot, right? Your reader's going to sit there and go, "Oh my goodness, what's the point? What's the point?" So identify scholars here, and then in your topic sentences, identify scholars there as well. Now, that's usually a no-no in an essay, right? Talking about scholars in a topic sentence because it gives them a lot of power. But in this paper, they need that power because it's all about them, all about the arguments that they're making and how their arguments overlap with one another. Okay, so then that brings me to our body paragraphs. In our body paragraphs, you want to identify in the topic sentence, like I said, the particular scholars that you're working with and the particular idea that their information in their source is interacting with others. Okay, now you'll want to use all of your scholars, your secondary source scholars in this essay, and throw in the primary source here and there as needed. But the main focus is going to be on those secondary source scholars and their ideas, right? So inside these body paragraphs is when we really get specific. Source A says this about this particular topic. If we're going back to that example of religion and contextual information about religion during the time period, right? Let's use that as an example. So scholar X, Y, and Z talk about religion during what would that be, mid 1800s, and they do it in the following ways, right? Obviously, the following ways is filler. You don't need to have that filler in there. Talk about the ways in which that intersects. Remember, being vague in this essay will not help you, okay? You need to be specific, point out specific pieces of information that will help you in your next essay, right? It's kind of that we're in a weird space now. We're focusing on what our scholars are saying, but we're looking ahead to how we could use it, right? So just sort of keep that in the back of your mind, maybe make some notes, in a notebook or something like that, and have that with you. So that way, when you go to utilize it later on, you say, oh, okay, yeah, I remember how I wanted to use this particular source to back up my idea. But in this, your idea doesn't come in, okay? So that's the big thing, right? You identify your primary source, your scholars that you're talking about with that particular idea, and the idea that's intersecting in your topic sentence of each body paragraph. Now, remember that these intersecting ideas should be related, but also they should be kind of specific, and really help dig in a little bit deeper, right? You'll want to say, okay, source X discusses this particular intersecting idea in this way, but like source Y talks about it like this, and source Z, either doesn't talk about it at all, because sometimes that happens. Scholars sometimes don't find information relevant to their argument. But if you're thinking, well, that's clearly in line with something they should be discussing, the fact that it's omitted is something to maybe point out, right? So in your body paragraphs, you want to get specific and talk about how these different scholars are talking about ideas differently, how they're talking about them similarly, maybe how source X, it says something, right? And then source Y seems to develop it further. That works, right? So it's all about identifying, the information that your scholars are discussing and kind of taking it to that next level. All right, so that will be those will be your body paragraphs. In your conclusion paragraph, then, right? Remember, conclusions mirror introductions, and they're very similar. They provide context. They remind the reader what they've just read, which in the intro they provide context and they tell the reader what they will read, right? So it's kind of two bookends to the body paragraphs that you have in the middle there. So in the conclusion, you want to remind the reader of any pertinent context, and you want to also identify the major intersecting ideas that you focused on. Now, you want to avoid, including any specifics, right? That's just a general rule for conclusions. You don't want to bring in any new information, right? It's just a nice refresher for the reader for you to say, all right, yeah, we talked about scholars, we talked about XYZ, these particular scholars, interacted with this particular idea. These sources interact with this particular idea, and then you go from there, right? And that'll round out the essay nicely. All right, so if you have any other questions or anything about historiography, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Do great things. I'm looking forward to seeing your outlines, where you'll get some comments about, kind of the direction that you're heading in. Remember, your ideas, keep them in here for now, okay? For the next essay, that's where you're in the driver's seat. In this essay, it's your sources, okay? So have a great one, and I will see you next time.